The courtroom was silent when the judge began reading the sentence. But the most chilling part wasn't the punishment. It was watching a man who had spent years controlling the fate of other people suddenly realize that his own fate was no longer in his hands. For some killers, the death sentence produces rage. For others, tears. Some plead. Some stare into space, as though they have already disappeared from the room. And then there are those who seem almost completely emotionless. These are the stories of killers whose crimes shocked the world, and what happened when they finally heard the words that could end their lives. But the first case became even more disturbing because of what happened after the sentence. January 24, 1989. Florida State Prison. Ted Bundy had spent years denying, manipulating, and fighting against the consequences of his crimes. But now, there was nowhere left to run. Bundy had been convicted of murdering 2 women at the Chi Omega sorority house and the brutal murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. As his execution approached, something unexpected happened. The man who had once tried to convince people he was innocent began making admissions. Bundy eventually confessed to numerous murders before his execution. And on the morning of January 24th, he was led toward the electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Inside, the final chapter of one of America's most infamous criminal cases was unfolding. Bundy's execution was carried out shortly after 7 a.m. But his death didn't end the fascination with him. It raised an uncomfortable question. Why did someone capable of such horrific crimes continue fighting so desperately to live? And Bundy wasn't the only killer to react differently when death became unavoidable. Gary Gilmore was different. He had been convicted of murdering a motel manager and a gas station employee in Utah. When the death penalty became certain, Gilmore did something almost unimaginable. He wanted the execution to happen. Gilmore refused to pursue further appeals. His final request was simple. He wanted to die. On January 17, 1977, Gilmore was executed by firing squad. His case became historically significant because it was the first execution in the United States after the Supreme Court's 1976 decision allowing the death penalty to resume. But his story exposed something deeply disturbing about capital punishment. For the state, the sentence was punishment. For Gilmore, it became something else entirely, a final act that he could still control. But not every condemned killer reacted with acceptance. Some fought until their final breath. John Wayne Gacy had murdered at least 33 young men and boys. For years, he had hidden behind an outwardly respectable image. He was a businessman, a community figure, a man who could smile for photographs while hiding a horrifying secret beneath his home. When investigators finally discovered the bodies buried beneath his house, the illusion collapsed. Gacy was convicted and sentenced to death. For years, he fought his conviction and continued attempting to control the story surrounding his crimes. But eventually, there were no more appeals capable of saving him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection in Illinois. Before his death, he reportedly maintained that he was innocent of many of the murders attributed to him. Even at the end, the man who had spent years controlling the narrative refused to completely surrender it. But another condemned killer reacted in an entirely different way. Richard Ramirez became known as the Night Stalker. He terrorized California during a series of attacks in 1984 and 1985. His victims were attacked inside their own homes. He killed, sexually assaulted, and terrorized people across multiple communities. When Ramirez was finally captured, his trial became a media spectacle. In 1989, a jury sentenced him to death. But Ramirez didn't behave like someone begging for mercy. He often appeared defiant. At one point, after being sentenced, he raised his hand and displayed a pentagram. His message was unmistakable. He wasn't going to give the courtroom the remorse people expected. Ramirez eventually died in prison in 2013 from complications related to cancer before the state could execute him. And that reveals another strange reality of death row cases. Sometimes the death sentence comes long before death itself. For decades, America has watched condemned killers enter courtrooms, hear their sentences, and face the possibility of execution. Some cry, Some rage, some confess, some maintain their innocence, and some seem almost fascinated by their own notoriety. But perhaps the most unsettling part isn't how these killers react to death. It's how differently they behave when they finally realize something they had denied for years. They can no longer control what happens next. The courtroom doors close. The appeals eventually run out. The prison cell becomes smaller. And somewhere beyond those walls, a clock keeps moving toward a date they cannot negotiate. For victims' families, the death sentence may represent justice. For the condemned, it represents the ultimate loss of control. And when that realization finally arrives, there is nowhere left to hide. Top of form, bottom of form,